Good evening. My name's Deborah Jacobs, and I'm here to welcome you on behalf of both Skidmore College, which I attended, and the Ernest Becker Foundation, for which I serve as Executive Director. As most of you know, the work of tonight's speaker, Sheldon Solomon, is based upon the theories of cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker, who won a Pulitzer Prize for his book, The Denial of Death, posthumously in 1974. In The Denial of Death, Becker argues that the fundamental motivation for human behavior is our biological need to control our basic anxiety, to deny the terror of death. With this biological need come staples of our existence, such as culture, religion, art, heroism, and procreation. And with this biological need come staples of our resistance, such as racism, greed, violence, economic inequality, and climate denial. I was one of thousands of students taught the work of Ernest Becker as a freshman at Skidmore College. Reading Becker's The Birth and Death of Meaning turned on a light bulb for me. It made sense of so many things that I had thought, felt, or observed in life. Becker's theories became a framework for my understanding of human behavior and have helped guide my efforts to make the world a more peaceful and just place. Sheldon and his co-author's book, The Worm at the Core, comes at an opportune time as a new dialogue about death in our country has emerged. As the baby boomer generation faces its latter years, Gen X and the millennials have created the death positive movement. For those of you who haven't heard about the death positive movement, please wake up and smell the green burials. This movement is asking people to reconsider how we die and how we think about death. Today, the Ernest Becker Foundation, and I want to note our founder, Neil Elgie, is here with us tonight. We're 25 years old, thanks to his hard efforts, and I know many of you are here to greet him. Yay. Today, the Ernest Becker Foundation is on a mission to raise awareness among leaders, policymakers, and the general public about the effects of the denial of death on individual and societal behavior. We want to use Becker's understanding of human motivation as a catalyst for self-awareness and social change. This, of course, is no easy task, so please keep us in mind when you win the Powerball on Wednesday. I'm just one of many students at Skidmore College influenced not only by Becker's thought, but by Sheldon's unique ability to present these complex ideas in understandable, exciting, and compelling ways. He's smart, dynamic, irreverent, and of the people. He was my favorite professor in college, and after tonight, he will be yours. Please welcome Sheldon Solomon. Where's Neil Elgie? He wants to know. There he is, back there. Wave, Neil.
Neil, where are you? Thank you, Neil. Hey, thank you, everybody. Can everybody hear okay? Folks in the back and Coach, everybody okay? Thank you so much for coming. It's a tremendous honor for me to be here. I know I've seen some of you all before, but then again, you all look vaguely familiar, but it's a lot of fun and also just nice to be back in Seattle. And this is a particularly lovely venue that I've never seen before, and it's my pleasure to tell you a little bit about the work that I've been doing with my colleagues and that appears in the book that we've written. And as Deborah has already mentioned, the work that I do is heavily influenced by the cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker. But let me back up a little bit and just start by pointing out that ever since antiquity, a lot of people, philosophers, theologians, more recently scientists, have spent a lot of time just thinking about the essence of our humanity. What is it that really captures what it means to be a human being? And I know many of you are familiar with the notion of humans as Homo sapiens. Who's heard that term before? And forgetting for a moment about whether or not we're worthy of that designation these days, I think everybody knows that that refers to human beings as uniquely and quintessentially rational and wise creatures. But that's not the only proverbial homo that has been advanced as just an effort to characterize what it is that makes us uniquely human. There was another one at the beginning of the 20th century, Homo ludens, the argument being that we're uniquely playful creatures. And then there was another one after that, Hannah Arendt. The idea was Homo faber, that we're tool-making creatures. And then we've got from Seattle, Ellen Dissanayake talks about Homo aestheticus, the idea that we're fundamentally aesthetic creatures. And my view is that all of those designations are useful for heuristic purposes. They give us, or they draw our attention rather, to particular aspects of the human experience that I think are worthy of our collective cogitation and deliberation. But I want to add another homo to the table. In our book, we call it Homo Mortalis. And I started thinking about this many years ago, actually, before I ran into Ernest Becker, or his work, rather. The Scottish essayist, a guy named Alexander Smith, in the 1850s, in a little essay, he said, "It is the knowledge that we have to die that makes us human." And then William James, a couple of decades after that, in the 1890s, he said that death is the worm at the core of the human experience, this being a not so subtle reference to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and Eve partaking of the apple from the tree of knowledge, and that rendering us aware of the fact that we will someday die. And then, as you've already heard, and many of you already know, Ernest Becker took that idea, and in 1974 was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for the book The Denial of Death, for elaborating that notion through an evolutionary and existential psychodynamic perspective in the service of trying to generate a comprehensive delineation of the psychological underpinnings of what motivates human beings to do the things that they do, for better and worse. And so what Becker says is that he proposes that what we do is to just start with the relatively Darwinian assumption that people share with all other forms of life a basic biological predisposition towards self-preservation in the service of survival and reproduction. And I think that's relatively straightforward. Equally straightforward is when he says, yes, we have that basic drive to stay alive with all other forms of life. On the other hand, we are arguably unique by virtue of our enlarged forebrain, and we have the cognitive capacities to think in abstract and symbolic ways, culminating in the unique ability to imagine things that do not yet exist, and then to have the audacity to transform our dreams into imagination. And I know I've been using the same example for a long time, but it's a good one. Historically, when Michelangelo was drawing pictures of helicopters in his notebooks in the 1500s, people said, wow, that's crazy. And yet today, here we are, routinely transported by what was originally denounced as the doodling of a madman. And I like how Otto Rank, one of Freud's disciples, put it when he said that only human beings make the unreal real. And I think it's pretty obvious that that's very handy in terms of helping us to stay alive. All right, let's hold that thought and move back in time. Darwin is the 1860s or so. And let's go back to Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish existential philosopher in the 1840s. Kierkegaard was just back in the day, we didn't even have psychology in those days. And he said, you know what? People are so smart that we actually become aware of the fact that we exist. Not a trick question, even for the Skidmore students. Who's aware of the fact that you sit here now listening to me or pretending to do so? All right, I'm going to take that as a unanimous affirmation. And the point that Kierkegaard makes is that we are constantly aware of the fact that we exist. Today in psychology, we call that self-awareness or self-consciousness. And Kierkegaard's point is that we take it for granted that we're self-conscious because, after all, most of us spend a lot of our days just kind of walking down the street saying, here I am, walking down the street. But the point that Kierkegaard makes is that only human beings are totally self-aware. And the point that he makes is that it takes a ridiculously sophisticated cognitive apparatus to, in his language, render yourself the object of your own subjective inquiry. All right, well, so what? In a little book called Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard went on to say, well, if you are aware of the fact that you exist, which he insists is the unique purview of the human animal, then you will necessarily experience two uniquely human emotions that Kierkegaard described as awe and dread, respectively. And I like those words because most of us are familiar with them. All right, so let's have like 90 seconds of awesomeness before things take a sinister turn. And note that there's something awesome and really profoundly uplifting about being alive and knowing it. All right, rhetorical question, who would prefer to be a person rather than a porcupine or a potted plant? Up to you to decide, but Kierkegaard's point is that some of our finest moments are not the result of anything great, although, Deborah, if you're in the back, I want to win the Powerball thing, but it's not the days that we wake up and we've done anything in particular, but some days you just wake up happy to be alive. Who's ever had one of those days? I grew up in New Jersey, so they're few and far between. Anyway, the point, and it's an important and profound one, and let's not forget it, is that it is indeed great to be alive. And the fact that we're not only alive, but we know that we're alive is really tremendously awesome and uplifting. Right, on the other hand, Kierkegaard turns right around and he says, okay, but if you're smart enough to be aware that you exist, you should also be smart enough to recognize that, like all living things, your life is of finite duration. I know it's a great night and I don't want to ruin it for you, but this means you as well as me. And what Kierkegaard pointed out is that this is a most unwelcome realization, the discomfort of which is magnified by the concurrent recognition that not only will you die someday, but you can die at any time for reasons that you could never anticipate or control. And then Becker, borrowing some ideas from Freud just to knee us in the psychological groin, he adds to that, yeah, we don't like that we have to die. We don't like that we could die at any time for reasons that we can't anticipate or control. And we don't like the fact that we're animals, that, like it or not, we're ensconced in a physical carcass, and that from a purely biological point of view, we're literally breathing pieces of defecating meat that are no more significant or enduring than lizards or potatoes. And the point that Becker asks us to entertain is that if that's all that we went around thinking about, I'm gonna die, I could walk out today and get run over by a car or smote by a comet, I'm a breathing piece of defecating meat. I'm Spam with a plan, but I've got no can. I'm a cold cut with an attitude. I got a lot of these. I'm a pate with panache. I'm a cerebral head cheese. I'm meat with a beat. Stop me, somebody. All right, but but anyway, you get the point, I hope. And what Becker argues is that those realizations, I will die, I could die at any time. I'm just a twitching blob of biological protoplasm. If that's all we thought about, we wouldn't be able to stand up in the morning. We would literally be potentially debilitated by overwhelming existential terror. And what Becker hypothesizes is that our ancestors rather ingeniously solved the existential dilemma that was engendered by the awareness of death, which is in turn an unanticipated byproduct of our vast intelligence through the creation and maintenance of what the anthropologists call culture, humanly constructed beliefs about the nature of reality that we share with fellow humans in the service of reducing death anxiety by giving us each a sense that we are valuable people in a meaningful universe. And so Deborah mentioned earlier one of Ernest Becker's early books called The Birth and Death of Meaning. And in that book, Becker talks about the human need to perceive that life has meaning and that each of us has value. And he points out that what culture does is to give us a sense that life has meaning in a variety of ways, including the fact that almost every culture in the history of Earth has an account of the origin of the universe. Almost every culture, in fact, all of them, have prescriptions for appropriate conduct that give us a blueprint of effective or acceptable action. And all of this is in the service of giving us a sense that we are potentially eligible for immortality, either literally in the form of the heavens, the afterlives, the souls, the reincarnations of the world's great religions, or symbolically, as the ancient Greeks pointed out. We may know that we are not going to be here forever, but we're comforted nevertheless by the realization that some vestige of ourselves will persist over time, perhaps in the form of having children, perhaps in the form of amassing great fortunes, perhaps in the form of writing a great symphony or book or producing a great work of art. All right, so on the one hand, in order to stand up in the morning, we have to think that life has meaning, that is necessary but not sufficient. We also need to believe that each of us as individuals has value. Again, rhetorical question, who remembers being a kid? I know that most of you do. And did anybody when you were a kid dream of doing something great? Anybody ever do that? I'm going to cure cancer. I'm going to be a great athlete. I'm going to make a lot of money and maybe do something good for the human race. And the point that Becker makes is that that's not pathological narcissism in and of itself. That's the normal yearning of the human animal to want to believe that each of us has some unique purpose in life, and the way that culture provides opportunities for us to feel valuable is through the social roles that we inhabit in the context of our culture, because every social role comes with it standards of what is considered admirable, and if you meet or exceed those standards, you can perceive yourself as a significant individual in a meaningful universe. So if you're a football player, your job is to play football and do it well. If you're a nurse, your job is to keep people alive. If you're a stockbroker, your job is to increase somebody's material well-being, and so on and so forth. Well, that's pretty much what Ernest Becker says. Human beings are unique by virtue of our vast intelligence. That in turn makes us aware of the fact that we will someday die. That unsettling realization gives rise to potentially debilitating existential terror that's mitigated by embracing culturally constructed worldviews that give us a sense that life has meaning and we have value. All right, two questions. One question is, so what? And the other question is, well, how do we know if any of this is true? And the so what question in my world as an experimental psychologist, and what a lot of scientists would say is, well, okay, here's some ideas. They may be interesting. But from a scientific point of view, the question is, well, okay, well, so what? What's the explanatory power? If we accept that what Becker is arguing has merit, then what does this help us understand that would be difficult or impossible to fathom otherwise? And then the other question is, I got to get a watch someday, checking my stocks. All right, anyway, so question number one is, so what? You know, what do these ideas buy us in terms of helping us understand the vagaries of human affairs? And then the second question is, yeah, how do we know if this is true? Although Ernest Becker won a Pulitzer Prize for the denial of death, he was roundly denounced by a lot of academics at the time as being too philosophical and therefore highly speculative and therefore unscientific. All right, so what I'd like to do in the rest of the time that we have together this evening is to just kind of tackle those two questions at the same time by bouncing through a couple of the areas of inquiry that Deborah already mentioned, and to talk about how Becker's ideas can help us understand a host of superficially disparate phenomena that, with regard to human behavior. And then I'll tell you a little bit about the experiments that I've done with my buddies Jeff Greenberg and Tom Pazinski. We started out in the 1970s, and we're still doing this work, and so are a lot of our students, and now a lot of folks around the world that we've never met before. All right, let's start with one of Ernest Becker's primary interests, articulated throughout his work, but really the central focus of his last book called Escape from Evil. And the question here is, why is it that people have such a painfully difficult time getting along with other people who don't share their beliefs about the nature of reality? And in fact, if you go back and look at human history, it's really not a pretty picture. I think a case could be made that it's been one long sequence of genocidal atrocities juxtaposed with the brutal subjugation of designated in-house inferiors. And there's no evidence that that has changed recently. And so the question is, why? Why can't we get along with people who don't salute the same flag, don't worship the same God, don't sing the same songs, or wear the same clothes? And Becker's response, and actually it's more complex than I'll have time to present this evening, but in short, what he asks us to consider momentarily is, let's assume he says that his argument is correct, that our beliefs about reality serve to reduce death anxiety. Well, the point that he makes then is, to the extent that that's true, then the mere existence of other human beings who do not share those beliefs is fundamentally threatening. Because if you accept the validity of an alternative conception of reality, you do so necessarily by undermining the confidence with which you subscribe to your own views. And when you do that, you literally eradicate the anxiety buffering properties of those particular beliefs. And so the point that he tries to get us to think about is that the mere existence of people who are different really threatens us, because it presents the possibility that our beliefs might be wrong. So if I believe that God created the earth in 6 days before taking a well-deserved break, and then I run into the people of the Borneo in the South Pacific, and they believe that the earth was gestated out of a giant coconut, well, if they're right, then I've got to be wrong. And so, well, what do we do when we run into people who are different? Well, the first thing that we generally do is to denounce or denigrate them. Well, okay, I believe God created the earth in 6 days. The Borneo think otherwise, but they're ignorant savages that are wearing grass skirts, living in tents, worshiping piles of sticks and mud. And of course, therefore, I'm being silly, by the way, they're not privy to our beliefs. I'm being silly, but there's an important point here, and that is, when you diminish the humanity of someone who adheres to different beliefs, it makes it much easier to retain confidence in your own. And while you're doing that, we generally try to get other people to change their beliefs and adopt ours instead. And if that doesn't work, just kill those poor bastards, thus proving that your beliefs are more potent after all. My God is better than your God, and we will kick your ass to prove it. And the point that Ernest Becker makes in Escape from Evil is that this may be one of the, certainly not the only, but one of the main reasons why we can't get along with people who are different, because it is very difficult to abandon our allegiance to our own death-denying beliefs. All right, so how do we know that this is true? This is where Tom and Jeff and I come in the early 1980s. We developed a very simple paradigm that I'm going to tell you a bit about, and it's going to help us out for the rest of our time this evening. And it's called the Mortality Salience paradigm. What we did was we thought to ourselves, well, okay, if Ernest Becker is right, then what would happen if in a laboratory situation we brought people into the lab and we reminded some people of their own mortality? And then in control groups, we remind people of something unpleasant but not fatal. So we're going to bring people into the lab. we're going to remind some people that they're going to die someday. Sometimes we just ask them to write down some of their thoughts and feelings associated with their own death. Sometimes we have them fill out a death anxiety questionnaire. Sometimes we have them watch gory films of like car accidents. Sometimes we don't do work in the lab. We bring people outdoors and we stop folks either in front of a funeral parlor or 100 meters to either side. Sometimes we do something even more subtle. We bring people back into the lab and we flash the word death on a computer screen for 28 milliseconds, so fast that you don't even know that you've been flashed. And all of the things that I'm about to talk about, doesn't matter how we remind people that they're going to die, it all produces the same effects. And so, for example, in one of our first studies, we asked Christian participants to either think about death or something unpleasant, and then we had them rate fellow students who either said they came from Christian families or from Jewish households. And what we found is that while our Christian participants did not discriminate one way or the other in the control condition, when they were reminded of their mortality, they liked fellow Christians a lot more, and they disliked Jewish people quite a bit. And some of you have heard me say this before. We did this study at the University of Arizona, and this is not about Christianity per se. The 5 Jewish people in Arizona were busy that day, so we had Christian participants in that particular study. If you go to Israel and you ask Jewish people to think about dying, they love Jewish people and they hate Christians. If you go to India and ask people to think about their own death, they love Indians, they hate Pakistanis, et cetera, et cetera. And this effect does not just obtain in attitudinal measures. In Germany, when Germans are reminded of their mortality, they sit closer to people who look German. And they sit further away from people who look like Turkish immigrants. In Iran, we worked with a fellow psychologist, and we reminded Iranians of their mortality. And then we asked them how much they supported suicide bombing and how much they would like to become a suicide bomber. And what we found was quite striking. In control conditions, Iranians were not all that enthused about suicide bombing, and they certainly didn't want to become one. But after they were reminded of their mortality, they were much more supportive of martyrdom activities and more willing to become a martyr themselves. I don't know about you, but I find that disconcerting. Right, in America, we are far too pragmatic to blow ourselves up, but we're happy to blow up other people. And so when Americans are reminded of their mortality, they become more supportive of the use of nuclear, chemical, biological weapons against countries who pose no direct threat to us. And this is particularly true of people who identify as politically conservative. I could tell you, if we had more time, hundreds of these studies, but I think the point that I would like to make is that there's a whole lot of evidence suggesting, and I like how George Bernard Shaw put this in a play called Heartbreak House, where he says, when the angel of death sounds his trumpet, the pretenses of civilization are blown from men's heads into the mud like hats in a gust of wind. All right, let's switch gears a little bit and let's talk about something that was very important to Ernest Becker, and that is, why is it that sometimes we become attracted to certain kinds of political leaders that we might not be overly enthusiastic about at other historical moments? Who's ever heard of the dead German sociologist Max Weber? Has anybody ever heard of Weber? My Weber joke is that if you need a non-pharmacological intervention for insomnia, a paragraph or two of Weber will do the trick. But I don't think that in any way undermines the importance of his ideas. And one of the things that Weber wrote about in the early part of the 20th century is the idea that in times of historical upheaval, people become particularly attracted to what he called a charismatic leader. Who's heard the term charismatic leader? Well, that comes from Max Weber, and he defined the charismatic leader as someone who is perceived by his or her followers as kind of a magical, larger-than-life figure who often proclaims, or whose supporters proclaim, that he or she has been chosen by God to rid the world of evil. This is often advanced as an explanation for how Hitler got in power in Germany. Who's familiar with that idea that Hitler may not have gotten all that many votes if things were going well in Germany? I would submit he probably would not. Well, I wasn't around in those days, but I was around in the aftermath of the terrible events of September 11th, 2001. Who remembers that? I know a lot of you do, those of us that are old enough to remember. And who remembers President George W. Bush, who before September 11th, 2001, had one of the lowest approval ratings of every president in the history of Earth? Who also remembers, though, that 3 weeks after the events of September 11th, President Bush had one of the highest approval ratings? Head shakes if you remember this, because this was amongst Democrats as well as Republicans. And Tom and Jeff and I, we got interested in this, and we're like, wow, how could this happen? Maybe the president metamorphosized from a functionally illiterate oil industry neocon meat puppet into an effective civil servant, maybe. Maybe, on the other hand, the events of September 11th constituted kind of a natural reminder of death. And maybe Americans embraced the president because, just like Weber said, when the psychological shit hits the fan, it makes us grope for someone who says, I will rid the world of evil. And indeed, that's what President Bush did say right after September 11th. He said, we will get the evildoers. And in October of 2001, he said, I believe that God has chosen me to lead the country at this difficult time. All right, well, we did a bunch of experiments in 2003 and 2004. And what we did was very simple. We just had some people think about dying and other people not. And then we said, well, what do you think about President Bush and his policies in Iraq? And what we found was really quite, I think, staggering, because in about a dozen experiments, we found that Americans across the country did not have particularly high impressions of President Bush or his policies in Iraq under psychologically benign conditions. But when they were reminded of their mortality first, their approval of the president skyrocketed along with their support for his policies in Iraq. In fact, in one study conducted 5 weeks before the 2004 election, we found that Americans in a control condition said they would be voting for Senator Kerry by a 4-to-1 margin, but those who were randomly assigned to think about dying said they would be voting for President Bush by about a 3-to-1 margin. I would ask you to just think about the ominous implications of that finding for democracy. And just for those of you that are willing to recoil in horror along with me, we just finished our first study demonstrating that when Americans are reminded of their death a month ago, it increased in a pronounced fashion their support for Donald Trump's candidacy for president and their willingness to vote for him. And I'm not trying to tell you who to vote for. I don't think this is a politically partisan claim. I think anyone who's a fan of democracy should be very concerned by the fact that a relatively subtle alteration in psychological conditions can have such profound effects on political preferences. All right, let's keep going a little bit, and let's talk about how existential concerns foster an alienation from nature and a contempt for the environment. In 1690, John Locke's second treatise on government, in a very lovely paragraph, he says, well, you know what? Anything in nature is like all things, it's ephemeral. Everything in nature is of finite duration. And indeed, some argue that's the psychological impetus for the construction of supernature. If we were happy with the natural state of affairs, there would be no need to conjure up an additional supernatural dimension. And in fact, what we find in our studies is that when people are reminded of their mortality, it makes us very uncomfortable, admitting that we're animals. In fact, we deny vigorously after we're reminded of death that we're animals. And after we're reminded of death, we have negative attitudes towards animals, and we're more willing to support killing them for reasons other than eating or medical research. When people are reminded of death, they become more uncomfortable with their own bodies, including basic biological functions. Even sex becomes more aversive after one is reminded of death. When people are reminded of their mortality, they are very uncomfortable in nature. There's some Dutch psychologists that I like a lot, and they showed Dutch people pictures of forests and pictures of suburban neighborhoods with lawns and stuff. And what they found is that in controlled conditions, the Dutch participants liked the forests more than the suburban neighborhoods, but when they were reminded of their mortality, they liked the neighborhoods better than the forest. And finally, when people are reminded of their mortality, they become more willing to exploit non-renewable natural resources. And so in simulated forest games, when people are told, oh, if you harvest too many trees, you're going to destroy the whole forest, well, under control conditions, people say, well, okay, I'm going to harvest fewer trees, but not when they're reminded of their mortality. They will exploit natural resources to the point where they're no longer able to be renewed. And of course, that runs the risk of rendering the planet that we now reside on unfit for human habitation. Of course, the jellyfish and the cockroach will be fine, but our descendants might have a tougher time. All right, so if we're going to talk about the degradation of the natural environment, I don't think we can do that without also pointing out that in the West, at least, in fact, increasingly in every industrial society that tries to emulate our way of life, people have an almost insatiable desire for money and stuff. I'm from New York. Do they have places to shop out here? I think they do. But anyway, and so why is it? If we had more time, I would talk a lot about the danger of insatiable desires, because any desire that is insatiable is ultimately unstable and unsustainable. Who's familiar with Tennessee Williams' Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, old timers? I love that play. Remember Big Daddy who says the human animal is a beast that dies. And if he's got money, he buys and buys and buys. And I think the reason he buys everything that he can buy is that in the back of his mind, he's got the crazy idea that one of his purchases will be life everlasting. And Ernest Becker writes very eloquently about the possibility that our insatiable desire for money and stuff is in part a result of existential anxieties. All right, well, sure enough, when we remind people of death and ask them, well, how much money do you want to have? They say they want to have more money, way more than they need, by the way. And when we remind people of death and we ask them, okay, what kinds of things do you want? They want a lot more things, not like a toaster or a pencil sharpener. They want like a Lexus and a Rolex, high status luxury items. When we remind people of death, this study was done by some Polish psychologists, and we asked them to draw pictures of coins and paper money. What we find is that after a death reminder, people draw the coins larger. We don't ask them to do that. We just say, hey, draw a quarter, draw a dollar bill. And I think this is ominous, that money literally looms larger on our minds after we've been reminded of death. Finally, they did another study where they asked people to count some money. They said, here's a stack of money, just count it. And in a control condition, they asked people to count a stack of pieces of paper. All right, and then they didn't get to keep the money, they just counted it. And after they did that, they measured death anxiety. Right? And what they found was the mere act of counting money reduced death anxiety. All right, well, what else? Let's talk about one more category of activities, and then we'll kind of sum up and muse about the implications of these ideas. Let's try and think about why there's epidemic levels of psychopathology in Los Estados Unidos. Who's aware of that fact, that America is a petri dish of psychopathology? According to the National Institute of Mental Health, about 12% of the people in the United States are depressed as we speak. About 1/3 of the people in the U.S. will be depressed at some point in their lives. I'm now depressed, having said that. All right, so 1/3 of the people in America are depressed or will be. Another third, más o menos, are addicted to drugs and alcohol. As far as I can tell, the remaining third are either watching television to see who can drink the most yak urine on Survivor, or they're in their SUV on the way to Walmart to see if they can save a nickel on a chainsaw and a lemon. And the point is, forgetting about me being silly, although I'm pretty serious about the equating of all of those disparate forms of psychological dis-ease, is that what Becker says is that, wow, when there are epidemic levels of unhappiness in any given society, the first thing that we need to look at are the values that that society espouses, to see if they are realistically attainable by the average individual. And so let's look at our society. Who's familiar with the fact that we tend to venerate people that have a lot of money and power? Is anyone vaguely aware of that? And who, like me, if you grew up in my day, who's familiar with the so-called American dream? This idea that if you really work hard, you can have as much money as Donald Trump or Bill Gates. Who remembers being told that in school? And of course, if you're 40 years old and you're wearing a polyester suit, selling a 3-pound burrito at the drive-thru at the Taco Bell, and you're not happy with minimum wage, well, that's your fault, because of course you didn't work hard enough. All right, now who's aware that there's very little economic mobility in reality in the US? You're more likely to get out of poverty in Bangladesh, and certainly in Canada, than you are in Los Estados Unidos. But if you're taught that if you worked hard enough, you could be very successful, can you see why that might be psychologically demoralizing? And who's also aware of the fact that we have ridiculous and impossible standards of physical attractiveness in our culture? And this is particularly true of women. As you know, if I can't floss my teeth with you, you're too fat and ought to have a license plate to appear in public. And the use-by date for the average woman in our culture continues to get younger and younger. And I'm being silly, but the point that I want to make, old-timers, let's go down memory lane without in any way romanticizing the past, but who remembers when it was okay to be average? Anybody remember that? All right, after all, the average person is average, right? And that just happens to be true. But I pity the children of today. If you're not as thin as a rail, if you haven't had several startup companies by the time you're 5, then you're a failure. And the point is that this is a recipe for psychological despair. All right, so Thomas Hardy, dead British novelist, and Ernest Becker uses this at the beginning of his last book, Escape from Evil. Hardy says, if a way to the better there be, it comes from taking a close look at the worst. And I guess that's what I've tried to do this evening, even if you found it a little unsettling. And the point that I would like to make is that malignant manifestations of death anxiety really bring out the worst in us. They make us depressed, hateful, warmongering proto-fascists plundering the planet in our insatiable quest for dollars and dross in a Facebook, television, alcohol, drug-induced stupor. And I don't think it's overly histrionic to think that in some ways we're really at the crossroads of human existence. Robert J. Lifton, a guy I admire a lot, psychohistorian, in a book called Destroying the World to Save It, Lifton says, we may be the first form of life to have the ignominious distinction of being responsible for our own extinction. I don't know about you, but I don't find that an uplifting observation, although there are some days when I wouldn't want to have to be on the side of the debating team to refute that contention. But I will, even at the risk of being perceived as naively optimistic. What I'd like to leave you with is just the fact that historically, humans have a pretty good track record in terms of extricating ourselves from a variety of very daunting difficulties once we're able to understand the underlying basis of them. All right, so who remembers plague in the Middle Ages? Not because you were there, but because you had social studies in school. Remember how over half of Europe was just keeling over because of the plague? And we used to think that the plague was caused by evil spirits, and no amount of exorcisms was successful for eradicating it as long as we believe that to be the case. On the other hand, once we discovered that it was bacteria and not evil spirits that was causing the plague, well, then we invented penicillin, and that got us to the advent of modern medicine, and probably why most of us who are here today are still upright and breathing. Similarly, what I would like to think is that we can do the same thing with regard to how we can use our understanding of how mortal terror has a consequential impact on human affairs if we could fully recognize the extent to which death anxiety underlies a substantial proportion of unfortunate human affectations. Well, then I'm confident, or at least I'm hopeful, that we can deploy our remarkable ingenuity in the service of minimizing, if not eradicating, the destructive potential that our fears can and often do release. And so let me leave you just with one of my favorite sayings. It's not a saying, it's a quote from Albert Camus. I know you guys know Camus. He scribbled this in one of his notebooks, and he said, "Come to terms with death. Thereafter, anything is possible." All right, maybe an overstatement, but certainly worth thinking about. And I hope that what I've said this evening is sufficiently provocative that each of you will be willing to at least give that a try. Thank you so much for being here, and thanks a lot for your attention.
Say that first that I haven't read your book yet, but I'm eager to buy it tonight.
Thank you.
From all the reviews, it sounds like there's more than ample evidence to support your hypothesis and your theory here. What I'm wondering is, in the experiments you've done so far, have you looked at, because I assume that 100% of the people, as in most experiments, did not display this this pattern of being reminded of their mortality and then being more judgmental, more aggressive, et cetera. Have you found any commonalities in terms of people who didn't and how we might use that information?
Wow. Great question. Did everybody hear the question? Yeah, excellent question, because I have spoken this evening as if these are monolithic effects of a binary nature, where you think about death and you vote for President Bush, or you think about death and you want a Lexus, and clearly there's individual variation. And while we have spent several decades trying to delineate what those variables are, I'm sure there's more to be learned. All right, but here's a few things that we know for sure. When we measure self-esteem, And here I wish we had more time, because when I say self-esteem, I don't mean narcissism, and those are two very different things. If you're a legend in your own mind, that's narcissistic, whereas genuine self-regard has a basis in reality. And there are ways to differentiate between narcissism and genuine self-esteem. So people with genuinely high self-esteem do not respond defensively when they're reminded of their mortality. Similarly, are you familiar with Bowlby's attachment theory, the distinction between securely and insecurely attached people? Anybody out, other folks, Bowlby people? All right, and if not, by the way, I hope anybody who has questions will write to me or we can talk afterwards. Securely attached people do not respond to death reminders in the same way as insecurely attached. It's not that they're unresponsive, but they respond differently. So a securely attached person reminded of their mortality, what they do is to become more firmly committed to their significant others. They have this increased bond to the people that they love. It's the insecurely attached that want to bomb the infidels. So there's another variable. I'm going to stop there because the other ones are globby, but how about if we chat either directly or beyond? Let me just applaud that question because it's a very important one. There may be biological differences. We're doing now, not we, people that have some skills, look at me, we're looking at, we're doing MRIs and seeing if different brain areas light up when people are reminded of their mortality. We know that it does light up unique parts of the brain, but maybe maybe there's differences that are also correlated with defensive reactions. So, great question. There's more to it, but let's you and I talk. Thank you.
Okay, so I have two questions. One's a quick one, and that is, did you want to be a Borscht Belt comedian when you grew up?
I didn't want to, but my mom and dad told me that was the only option available to me.
Okay. Okay.
In fact, my mom and dad are dead, but I wish they were here because they always said, you'll never get away with it. You need pants at least.
You could wear a kilt.
And so they said I was a clown. So yes, the answer is yeah.
And then the other one is, there's one thing you didn't mention in all your talk about how thinking about death makes people make decisions that aren't necessarily wise to themselves. And that is the whole issue about U.S. gun control. And I am just curious if you have done studies that might help those of us who don't want to arm the entire U.S. population, although functionally it is by the number of guns, to do something about the death issue, to convince people that owning a gun is not necessarily life-affirming.
A great point. And the short answer is we've not done that yet, but we're about to. So talking today with Deborah and people at the Becker Foundation, we think this is an important area of inquiry. I have no doubt. We know, anecdotally at least, gun sales have skyrocketed since the attacks in Paris and San Bernardino, and therefore I suspect that people reminded of their mortality will be more eager to possess guns. We also know, turning this around, there was a great study, we didn't do it, but in ambiguous situations, when people are reminded of their mortality and they see somebody holding an object, they're more likely to perceive it as a gun. And I think this can help us explain a lot of the really unfortunate, not excuse, but explain a lot of the unfortunate situations where police seem to be, just really killing folks unnecessarily and repeatedly. And again, I'm not defending this. I'm saying that it may be understandable under this framework. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sir.
So you voiced your concern with the elections and the Bush vote, with people being affected by their death awareness. And I was wondering what your opinion on the exponentially growing commonality of people getting psychology degrees to go into marketing and political advising and capitalize on things like death anxiety. Is that an answer?
Wow. I mean, yeah. What I can say with great confidence is that the people who manage elections are very much aware of this work and are capitalizing on it. It's also very well known that advertising is just applied social psychology. And yes, the fact that when you're reminded of death, it increases your zeal to consume. And it's not only Lexuses and Rolexes. People reminded of death eat more cookies, they smoke more cigarettes, they drink more alcohol. And this does raise, I think, interesting moral and ethical questions. Good point.
Just wondering if you've done any research to the opposite. If you're thinking about being alive and present, do you get the opposite effect?
Very great question, and the question is, what happens when people are asked to think about being alive? We have tried that a few times. We call that life salience, and what we found so far is nothing, but no, and I'm not giving up on that because I think you have a good point. The difference is that when you think about dying, well, most of us are not yet dead, and yet if we're alive and asked to think about being alive, that's not a fundamental alteration in our physical state. All right, but you do make a good point, and that is that we've spent, Tom and Jeff and I, the last 40 years almost, trying to think about the unsavory ramifications of people being reminded of their mortality. And we're much more interested right now about not so much the denial of death, but how to foster the affirmation of life. And I hope to be able to come back someday. I have another idea for a book, but we were 5 years late on this one, so it may take me a while. But I think that that's an important avenue of inquiry, even though we haven't done much on that yet. So thank you for that. Sir?
Hey, you talked at the beginning about the death positive movement. So after learning so much about, the horrors that can come from my mortality and the knowing of it, how do I become more death positive? How do I look at my mortality proactively?
Excellent question. High dollar question, very important. All right, so there's a big difference between what we do in our experiments and what the death positive folks are lobbying for. Our experiments use very subtle and very fleeting, even unconscious reminders of death, right? You're standing in front of a funeral home, or you have death flashed, and it's those fleeting death reminders, which, by the way, we're surrounded by every day. Those are the ones that engender the defensive reactions. What all of the theologians of antiquity and today point out, as do a lot of philosophers, is that that's very different than a sustained and highly focused and conscious confrontation with the inevitability of our respective demises. And that can have quite the opposite effect of making us comfortable with the reality of the human condition, and it brings the best out of us and in us. So I think that's an important point. And I don't think it sure sounds like it's a contradiction, but I don't think it is. Nicely done, thank you. Sir?
Sheldon, I'm curious about your thoughts or your work with children and teenagers. I've heard they think they are impervious to death, and I've heard that the children are innocent. Is there anything that you have to say about that, or anything we could do in elementary or at the high school level about it? And And what effect does the thoughts of death have?
Yeah.
I'll take the answer sitting down.
Yeah, let's do that. Another great question. For obvious reasons, we haven't done that much work with children. We do know from an Israeli study that around age 8 or 9, if kids are reminded of death, it makes them hostile to other kids who are different. But the implications for what we ought to do with respect to basic education, I think remain murky. I know one thing that we shouldn't do is to obscure or deny the fact of death throughout our entire society writ large over the course of the lifespan. But I don't think it follows from that we should be having the kids in preschool read Ernest Becker, or even in golden book form. But we'll talk about that, and I think that's another important area of inquiry. Sir?
Yeah, I appreciate your exploration and research and experimentation. In the early 70s, I spent time with John Lilly, who did some exploring, and
Excellent.
I had the first isolation tank in the state of Washington. And in the early 70s, I was also with Salvador Roquette in Mexico, who had this 2-year psychotherapy program using natural hallucinogenics to bring people up against their fear of death and of love. And at an experiential level, I'm wondering, in addition to buying your book, what other things you might recommend?
I never said to buy my book, although I need shoes. I like the Lilly approach better, frankly. And there's some striking research right now. Are some of you all familiar with, there's now some work with psilocybin and LSD in terminally ill cancer patients, and that a single exposure is having the same kinds of profound effects that in the 70s were dismissed as just the raging imagination of hippies run amok. So I think that, well, that's a good way to proceed. There's some evidence that meditation and mindfulness are quite effective. As I was saying earlier, this is where we're now turning our attention to see how we can reverse these defensive reactions. Nicely done, good point.
Turn that down. I appreciate what you were talking about with Donald Trump and how there was an increase in attention to him after the attacks in December. My curiosity is, I would assume that many people would go towards a candidate that shared their theological perspective, and yet his theological stance is not as strong as some of the other candidates. Do you have any thoughts about whether it was because he is an effective bully, so is therefore maybe an effective defender, or because he is godlike in his stature of money, he has so much money? Do you have any thinking about that?
No, I think you did it quite well. I mean, money is secular God in the 21st century. Mr. Trump is a caricature of a stereotype of a charismatic leader. I will make America great again. I will build a wall to keep everybody out, forgetting about the fact that most illegal immigrants come here with visas and then stay when they're expired. And then, I will bomb the shit out of ISIS. It's a very kind of what Weber would say. It really fits the bill. And in our experiments with regard to President Bush, the religion of the participant and their political orientation did not matter. And so it could be that under very dire historical circumstances, all of those considerations are momentarily obliterated.
Okay, thank you.
Sir?
So you might have covered this, or you did partially in the last few responses, but I was thinking back to when you talked about the polarities of terror and awe, the two kind of twin polarities of experience. Have you thought about, or has anyone done any similar testing or research, introducing the opposite of terror, death, and what this leads to, like introducing the possibility of awesomeness of life?
Yeah. We've not, and it should be done. There is a very talented psychologist who's been in Seattle, Kirk Schneider, who's at the Saybrook Institute in California, where Rollo May was. And Schneider talks about the need to re-infuse our lives with awe. And we just haven't gotten there yet, but I think that's a productive direction.
So if realizing our mortality makes us more inclined to reproduce, why do you think that when the people in your studies were reminded of death, that sex was aversive to them? While like food was, like they ate more cookies.
Wow. No, don't go away. Come on back. No, that's actually a great question. When people are reminded of their mortality, and we ask them, "Do you intend to have children? How many do you want to have, and when?" They say they're more certain that they want kids. They say that they want more of them. They say that they want to have them sooner, and that they're more likely to name them after themselves. But they evidently, while doing that, are not thinking about the biomechanical docking maneuver necessary to render that inclination manifest. But you make a good point. But then when we remind people of their mortality, and we ask them about how pleasant they find the physical aspects of sexual encounters, they find them not at all attractive. Good question.
Right, thank you.
We all right? Sir.
Sir, Sheldon, what do you think of the significance of the idea of being alienated from people around you, or and the attraction of the idea of going to heaven? You'll be with your old comrades, friends, and family, and I think of all the suicides of veterans who they're not in touch with people they feel at home with, and youngsters and persons who purposely commit suicide on the highways, 60,000 a year. So the significance of being alienated as a big fear.
Agreed. I don't have much more to add to that, except to note that there are studies suggesting that alienation is a manifestation of existential anxieties. Yeah.
I was thinking, what would be the next thing for you, or like what's the thing that, as you think about, is just unknown to you or keeps you up at night and you just can't quite wrap your head around it?
Wow. Honestly, what keeps me up at night is just watching the news every day. I know that sounds silly. Or to put it another way, and again, at the risk of sounding glib, what keeps me up at night is the possibility that these ideas are actually, quote, true, and that we have put ourselves as a species at risk by virtue of that fact. So if someone says to me, "Oh, well, what's your to-do list? What are the things that we better work on as a species?" I'm like, "Oh, war, the degradation of the natural environment, raging economic instability in the form of magnified inequality, petri dish of psychopathology, insatiable desire for money and stuff." I'm like, wow, those are pretty big problems, and they all, in my opinion, have this common existential psychodynamic underpinning. So I guess that's what keeps me up all night. Thanks.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I'm wondering if you ever conducted any studies on asking people to consider the deaths of others and what effects that had on a defensive reaction or...
Yeah, great question. You guys are great, by the way. If anyone has any inclination of becoming an experimental psychologist, come find me, because there's some talent out here. And no, I mean this as a compliment. These are very thoughtful and provocative questions. The short answer is yes. We've done several studies where we ask people to think about the death of a loved one. And what we find so far is that only causes a defensive reaction when thinking about the death of a loved one reminds you of your own mortality, which sounds kind of not great, but that's what we've found so far. I do not believe that, though, because we have not yet had parents come in and ponder the death of their offspring. I think that would be different, and I'll get back to you on that. That's a great...
strangers on the xenophobic effect and that
yes.
sort of thing. Is,
oh, yeah, we do know that the death of people that are different reduces your own death anxiety, that keeps me up at night also. All right, one more.
Just what is the effect of the, on this defensive effect of death reminders on young people using violent video games where you have death, 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 hour after hour? I mean, so my question is, does that immunize them against this defensive reaction?
Wow. All right, another, again, high-dollar question. The answer is, the jury is remarkably out. Who, like me, thinks that surely spending all your waking hours killing things on a video screen can't be great? But it's not clear how bad or not it is at this point. I wish I could be more confidently assertive in terms of saying it goes one way or the other. There is one thing, though, that I would point out about the killing video games, and that is that, after you get killed, you just push the button and your creature pops up again. And as far as I can tell, that's never happened to someone who's had their head actually shot off in a real setting. All right, the question is a good one. Let me thank you again, everybody, for coming, but let me also just remind you that I'm Sheldon Solomon. I work at Skidmore College. You guys know how to get on the internet. I'm on email. I'm happy to exchange ideas. I'm happy to send you the actual laboratory studies of any of the work that I mentioned here. And this was a great evening. Thanks for coming, and thanks for your fine questions. Have a great night.